program zaprasza sponsor PKN Orlen, mecenas kultury.
Miłych chwil z kulturą życzy Lotto.
It's very nice to be here in Żelazowa, Wola. Kevin Kenner, my warmest congratulations for a fantastic recital. I had the good fortune to listen inside the room, actually.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's lovely to be back here. It's such a wonderful atmosphere, very special here.
Well, that is my first question, actually, because your program consisted of mostly early works, and we have mazurkas, polonaises. How does it feel to play in Żelazowa, Wola? Does this birthhouse and the whole area here with the famous willow trees, does it inspire you as a pianist?
Absolutely. That was the primary reason that I chose this program, because obviously if you go to a birth house, you're thinking about the young Chopin and all the environment and those things that influenced his early style. And of course the countryside in this part of Poland with those willow trees and just the feeling of nature here and the out of doors, I think is very noticeable in those early works.
How would you describe the early style of Chopin?
Well, it is obviously very much inflected with Polish folk music traditions. That's what he was surrounded with. You know, I believe his mother was from Kuyavia, and probably had some knowledge of the folk music. I believe she sang, and we know that he traveled around to different parts of Poland and was hearing this folk music. So that's obviously one element that's obvious. And then there's something else that comes through that's very special in the young Chopin. And I think it's even more noticeable when you read some of his letters. He was a very humorous young man. He had such a great sense of humor. I recently read that he used to be able to sort of contortion his body around and you know, just do all kinds of crazy things. And his little newspaper that he wrote, you know, for his...
The Courier.
Yeah, exactly. I think he loved having a good laugh. And when I play those early mazurkas, for instance, I think they are so filled with surprises, little silences, little change-ups that we don't expect. And they're intended, I think, to put a smile on our face. It's really such entertaining music, and it's such a joy to see that side of him, because obviously the more mature works, you don't see so much of that. It sort of internalizes and has a very different flavor.
Well, you say the young Chopin could contort his body in a funny way. When you read his letters, you can clearly see that, I say this in inverted commas, he could contort words as well. He played with words in a very clever and very humorous way.
Really?
You also
Yeah.
see, yes.
I wouldn't notice that so much because I didn't read anything in Polish, but I'm sure that, you know, that would have been part of his wit.
Yeah, part of his wit sort of puns on French words in Polish, so all kinds of things. But my question here is, when we have this contortion in inverted commas, do you see that in music too, kind of contorting what would be most expected into something else?
Well, yes, of course, that's exactly it. It is when things take a turn that you didn't expect. Sometimes he'll move from a harmonic center rather abruptly and just sort of just take this little detour. And that is what awakens us when we hear that, what we didn't expect. And you have to set that up. And it takes a real master to be able to, just like a comedian, and you know, not anyone can just go on stage and read out a bunch of jokes. There is a certain mastery of timing, placement, and how the punchline is prepared. That's the art of comedy. And I think that it's there in his music, not just in the mazurkas, but in the rondo, in the variations. It's very prevalent in the early works.
Well, humor in music is a very big topic.
Yes.
But could you explain humor in music to someone who has little experience of understanding the musical jokes?
Well, first of all, humor means different things to different people, to different composers. So right now we've just spoken about that aspect of humor that's very light and refreshing, but humor, its roots really goes back to the Greeks and the idea of the different temperaments inside us, the humors that lived in us and affected our, if you play Schumann, humor is a very important part of his language, but it's not always funny. And I think that he took that from the German idea of humor, from Jean-Paul Richter, for instance, who, in fact, there is some inversion of humor there that actually it can put a tear in your eye, and yet it is still an aspect of humor. I think for some composers, when you see how the folly of human beings, of how small we are in relation to the great universe around us, that is in itself a kind of humor of the gods, that they put us in this situation. And it's not always pleasant, but it is a part of humor. And that's, I know we're not talking about Schumann, but I think he was the master of understanding the different sides of humor. And he really explored that in almost a spiritual way. If you play the Davidsbündner Tänze or something like this, where, it's Chopin didn't really pursue that side of humor in the same way. I don't think that the German direction of German Romanticism, but certainly the lightness of the entertaining qualities of humor that were found particularly in the Stil Brillant, the brilliant style, and all those composers that were showing off their virtuosity and their skills. There's a lot of humor in that style of playing.
What makes these works you play today stand out, in my opinion, is that it is the young Chopin. So there is, I think, generally the absence of what you refer very often to as le jal, so this kind of sorrowness that is present in Chopin's music. So would you agree with that? So he developed this kind of jal thing much later.
I think that it's there. You can hear it in some of the polonaises. Remember, we call them sometimes polonaise mélancolique, and certainly in, for instance, the B flat polonaise and the D minor polonaise, there are those moments that really do have that darker side, but it's within a certain boundary. The Nocturne, I think, certainly was the beginning of a great exploration into that genre, which does explore something really very, very sorrowful. And I believe that was composed around the time that his sister passed away.
Yeah.
So, he was familiar with tragedy at that age. It just doesn't come through in a lot of those early works until he left Poland. And then obviously being away from family and as he later had to deal with his own health issues and the expectations that he had for life that could not be fulfilled, then that all creeps in.
So perhaps it is a question of tragedy present in the works, but not yet the nostalgia he developed later when abroad. Or you feel there is some nostalgia in these works because it's a typical Polish trait in music?
Well, yes, if you listen to the folk music, it's not always particularly happy, is it? A lot of them are in the minor modes.
The Kujawiak especially.
Yes, exactly. So that certainly can be found. But what's interesting, I think, let's take the example of, say, Opus 7, number 2, Mazurka, of which I play an older version of that, which had that little 8-measure duda he put at the beginning.
So like the bagpipe.
The bagpipe, that's right. But later that became something that he articulated differently when it was published. And it takes on a little bit more of that melancholy. You can hear it. But in the early version, it's articulated in such a way that it seems that it is lighter. And so it transforms. even in the same piece.
Yes.
And that was something that really was remarkable in my discovery of some of these early works, is how many different versions there are of these works. And that is a kind of window into perhaps the way that he understood music as something constantly in flux. He wasn't necessarily aiming for a final product as Beethoven did, but he was really interested in the spontaneous. And I'm quite sure that many of those early works would have been played with different ornaments, different rhythms, even different harmonies at times, just to change it up. That music was for him something, this is my opinion of it, was something always surprising and changing and in flux, as I said.
Would you defend this opinion as a member of the jury of the Chopin competition too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Why? I know we've had long discussions about what edition of the Chopin works should we consider to be official. And I find the whole discussion to somehow be a little bit out of sync with what I understand about Chopin himself. That when he would send off to his publishers different versions of the same pieces, different waltzes, for instance, that you can find 3 different sources for that.
Concertos.
Yes, so if a performer happens to mix some of those different versions together in a way that is tasteful, this is marvelous. This shows originality. It also shows, hopefully, stylistic mastery. But simply to be true to one version of one edition and just think that that is your final ideal is, I think, in some ways missing the point. I would never hold it against someone who plays only from the Ekir version or the Paderewski version, but I'm just saying it's something that I have felt that I missed in many years of my work with Chopin's pieces, and now I wish to explore that as much as possible. I think it's a discovery.
Well, that's quite fascinating to discuss it because, opinions can be very strong. And I remember I sneaked into the jury room in 2010.
Did you?
That
was very naughty of you.
No, I was the press director of the competition. I was allowed to do that still. But what I was going to say, that I remember I kind of, to put it in a musical way, sforzato from Food Song in a discussion with you on some editions especially. So it just shows that people do have strong opinions on that.
Yeah, it's very easy to fall into what I would call a musical dogmatism, or, excuse the term, but even musical fascism.
Oh, it's a very strong
It's a very strong word. But when, for instance, you simply say this version is right and the other versions are just wrong. And to me, this doesn't belong in music. It is so much to do with taste. Taste is such an important part of what we do. And in the Baroque age, taste was the primary judgment of a good quality performance. It was not about what edition do you play from. There were no editions to play from. And I feel that this is something that we have lost sight of that. And we put these works sometimes in a museum and cover them in glass, and we can't really approach them and give them flesh and blood. To me, there's no room for dogmatism, or excuse that F word, but that's how I see it. I think that it's sort of putting levels of, well, this interpretation is obviously the best, and anything else is going to interfere with that. And it's unfortunate, especially for young, aspiring musicians who are discovering this music. And I think that music benefits from diversity, from different viewpoints, as long as they are informed. That can be the problem. And in this, I would absolutely agree with many of my colleagues who feel that some young performers dismiss the score. This is not good taste, to simply do as you want without
Show your
really
ego.
being in. Well, of course, we do what is in us, but there's. I like to think of something that my teacher, Leon Fleischer, who passed away recently, very sorely missed, and he taught me something about the performer's role in music. He saw music as light and the performer as a prism through which the light comes through and is refracted in its particular colors, in its particular way, depending on how that
into a rainbow,
prism,
if you like.
Well, yes, absolutely. That all the refractions of light come through depending on how the prism was cut. And that is a beautiful thought. But unfortunately, what happens, this can often be mistaken for the performance that is not translucent or transparent, but is somehow opaque, and it stops the light and simply represents what the performer wants to do. And that is a form of control that I think is not the role of the performer. We are servants of the music, and it goes through us in our particular way. We try our best to understand the essential components and to express them in the most natural, stylistic, tasteful way. That's how I see it. So in this sense, being informed about all the editions, all the sources, this is a wonderful adventure. So it means there's a lot of responsibility, especially in the music of Chopin, because we do have different sources to look at.
Well, what a beautiful metaphor. And then let's add another dimension, that is the instrument that you choose. Today you played on a beautiful Erard, which I have to say, in this very space, and a small room in a manor house, sounds just fantastic. So how does an Erard piano inform your interpretation?
Well, it was. It may seem that the music that I played was suitable to that instrument. But to my ears, actually, it was that instrument was a little too mature. It was an instrument from, I believe, 1838. All the pieces that I played today were from 1827 to 1830 or so, when they were composed, not necessarily published. And but of course, any of these period instruments have a certain clarity of sound, a beautiful articulating kind of chiff at the beginning of the sound that allows for a lot of work with the pedaling. Chopin pedaled quite a lot in his scores, and you sort of understand that a little bit when you play those old instruments. But in fact, if I really were going to choose the ideal instrument for this room and in this place with that repertoire, it would probably be a Viennese instrument, not an Erard. The Viennese instruments were even lighter action. Well, you know this, I'm sure, of course, and have such a crystalline kind of sound. And they don't have a big dynamic range, but what a wonderful color range. You can really change the color, with just a slightly different touch. It's marvelous, and there's never any thickness to the sound. This has a bit of body, the Erard, certainly. It's a lovely instrument, but probably it would have been very nice to play a ballade, for instance, on there, because it has a little bit more of that singing sostenuto quality compared with a Viennese instrument.
Well, I, of course, completely agree with you. Still, I love the sound of this instrument
sure.
here.
I'm not complaining.
And what I have to say amazed me was because when you come here to Żelazowa Wola, you hear the birds sing, and then actually in the upper register in the Rondo alla Mazur, I heard the birds.
I heard them too.
That was the echo of what I heard in the park.
Yes, and I imagined them when I was learning it. You know, it's actually a sort of a new piece that I just sort of discovered recently. And when I started playing those little trills up there, I thought, of course, that's nature. It just comes through. It's marvelous. His imagination.
Fantastic.
And of course, when you play it in places like this, then it becomes even more. It's just a revelation. It all fits.
So, in a sense, music and nature form a continuous line here, especially performed on a period instrument. That was my impression.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
So just to finish our interview, I have a surprising question for you. But, well, it's my reaction to your concert.
Yeah.
Have you ever been to a Polish folk wedding? Like real folk wedding with live folk
let
music?
me say this, that I had the great privilege of marrying a good Polish girl. And although we married in a very small ceremony in the US, we came back to Poland. And we had a lovely wedding ceremony in Białystok on someone's działka out there in the forest with many of our friends. And we danced a polonaise, and we did the whole thing. So I had a little bit of that, but I certainly didn't experience the real folk wedding that I understand goes on for many days, and there's a lot of alcohol.
I don't have that experience, but my impression was when listening to your mazurkas, the early Chopin mazurkas, that it was actually a folk band under your fingers, somewhere hidden inside you. So that is why I was asking, how come an American from California knows all that?
That's a very interesting point that I have thought a lot about, because I know, when I mentioned that F word earlier on, that there is a kind of idea that only a Pole can play a Chopin mazurka. Oh, you've heard that. I've heard it too.
But I don't agree.
Of course. Well, why? I don't agree. I've spent my whole life trying to prove otherwise. Because I believe that music doesn't have a nationality. It doesn't have a sex. It doesn't have a religion. It's benign in some ways. It simply exists, and it waits and invites for someone to discover it. You don't have to be German to play Beethoven. We all know that.
Yes.
But somehow with Chopin, this idea leaks in.
No. Just let me explain my question, because I can imagine hundreds or even thousands of beautiful and valid interpretations of the mazurkas.
Yes.
It's just that this kind of folk resonance that I heard today was so special, and I mean it as a compliment to you, that I thought he must have been to a folk wedding, because it's this kind of experience that informs you as a musician, and I thought you had it. But maybe this działka wedding was it.
I think therein lies the power of imagination. And even a person who's never seen a folk wedding can somehow, through some experience of the score, figure out rhythmically and articulations and timing. All these things can sort of be found, and it can be adopted. It's just like a language. People can adopt other languages and pick it up. And maybe there's a slight Americanism in there, I don't know. But there are some things in culture that do overlap and leak into other cultures as well. So
it's just all human.
Yeah, and I did spend 40 years in this country, back and forth, sort of living with this culture. So I'm obsessed with Polish culture. It's changed my life since I was a 17-year-old boy, and so perhaps there's something there. I don't know. But,
well, Kevin Kenner, thank you so much for sharing your imagination with us.
You're very welcome. Lovely to talk to you, Alec. Yeah.
Thank you for the interview. Lovely. Thank you.
Okay.
Na program zaprosił sponsor PKN Orlen, mecenas kultury.
Miłych chwil z kulturą życzy Lotto.